We are now live. Good evening, everyone. This is Arwan. This is Ishan Sharma, and as you can see, I have a very special guest with me on the screen, Professor Richard Cohen. Professor Cohen was drawn to the languages, literature, and cultures of South Asia in college when he studied for a year in India at the Maharaja Sayajirao University, Baroda. Dr.
Mm.
Cohen lived in a Rajasthani village for 2 years as a Peace Corps volunteer and later specialized in the classical and medieval languages, Sanskrit, Prakrit, and Apabhramsa, in graduate school at the University of Pennsylvania. In addition to his research and teaching activities, he administered South Asia centers at various several universities as well as directed a research library for a couple of years in Hyderabad, India, as a Fulbright scholar. His intellectual interests lie primarily in the medieval transitional languages and the literature of North India, such as Apabhramsa, early Hindavi, and Awadhi. Through such literature, one can trace the cultural continuities within South Asian civilizations as it undergoes changes in response to the arrival of Islamic cultures. He developed an interest and specialization in Jainism through his work in Prakrit and Apabhramsa, and in early South Asian Sufism through a study of its literature and developing material for syllabi on the role of Islam in South Asian civilization. Dr. Cohen is keenly interested in the development of Indian cinema, particularly in the post independent period, how it manifests a political and cultural change. Today, for this Caravan special lecture, he is going to talk about the Chandayan, the sacred and profane in medieval Indian Sufism. And we'll also get to listen Professor Cohen playing his guitar and singing a song for all of us towards the end of the session. All the participants who are with us, they can send in their questions for Dr. Cohen in the chat box, and we'll be taking those questions in the audience question and answer round. Without further ado, I formally invite and welcome Professor Cohen to deliver today's Caravan special lecture. Thank you so much, sir, for accepting our invitation.
Well, I'm so pleased to be here, Eshan, and I also welcome anyone who has joined us. First of all, let me just say that your organization is bringing a wind, a breeze of fresh air into thinking about the how to do the historiography of India, or shall we say South Asia more broadly. Um, it's sort of a paradox, is it not, that while I don't want to discount all of the great senior and upcoming Indian historians, for example, and their work, but before we started this session, I was talking with Eshan about the rigidities of textbook making and syllabi making in Indian higher education or education in general, and how it's really too bad that faculty don't have, excuse me, a lot of freedom in deciding what their students are going to read and what they're going to discuss. And we all hope and pray for the day that India will loosen up its very tightly controlled educational system, which I'm not putting down as not a successful one. It has its own successes. There's no doubt about it. All you need to do is look at the medical community in the United States. 35% of doctors in the United States are South Asians, and that group would not be there today if they hadn't studied very hard and were excited to enter the field of medicine, probably to a certain extent encouraged by their parents. But the point is that India is very good at preparing young minds for careers. There's no doubt about that. But preparing your mind for a career and making sure that you have an open mind at the same time to consider all kinds of perspectives and views is also important. So today I want to talk a little bit about a project that I've been working on for too many years, in fact, um, a translation and a better understanding of the content of a medieval Indian Sufi text called Chandayan. Right? It's often mispronounced as Chandayan, when actually all the first two A's are long, Chandayan, right? And it's based upon the heroine's name, Chanda. Marg Publications will be bringing out the book, hopefully in January of next year. And the book will be very special in many respects. It will not only be the first complete, and I put that in quotes, and I'll explain in a second, the first complete translation of the Chandayan, but it'll also contain over 300 color plates of images from manuscripts that were produced in the second half of the 15th century. Perhaps that's debatable, but art historians keep talking about the dating of the Chandayan illustrated manuscripts all the way up to the beginning or the end of the late 16th century. So these images will help us understand the evolution of Indian painting styles, because many of each illustrated manuscript is in a different painting style from different regions of Central and North India. So that will be important. Another contribution. So the discussion of the paintings will be done by Professor Qamar Adamji, who is an art historian with a PhD from New York University, whose PhD is on, in fact, the Chandayan illustrated manuscript. So she is the best person in the world to discuss that. So she'll add a chapter to the book, and another chapter, a very special chapter by Dr. Vivek Gupta, who I understand might have joined us today, in fact. Dr. Gupta is an art historian, but he's also gone into a subfield of art history, which has to do with the orthographies of Sultanate and later Sultanate or Mughal period manuscripts. And I've always found in my career, when I work with art historians on Indian manuscripts, that there's a folio, right? And you have a recto and a verso side. And the recto side will be illustrated and the verso side will have a text on it. In the past, art historians have by and large ignored the verso side of such folios, which is incredible, I find, because it's so often the case that the verso side informs us so much about the recto side, right? But art historians are fixated on images and not on text, whereas Dr. Gupta is combining in himself an interest in and an expertise on both sides of the folios, and I congratulate him for that, and I'm waiting to see his contribution to the book, which will discuss how the mainly Nusk orthographies were adapted to represent the Awadhi dialect. So I'm also a historical linguist, and I am very interested in the transition from Apabhramsa to the North Indian dialects, such as Awadhi. It's not been well understood that this transition is in fact here. Yeah, don't show that yet. That this transition is very important to understand, because the Sultanate period is really a period in which India is encountering Islam, Islam is encountering India, and there's all kinds of fusions going on. I wouldn't call them necessarily syncretisms at this point, but there's a lot of fusion going on. And it isn't until the Mughal period that this fusion process is slowing down, and sort of Persianate culture is beginning to flower in India in a big way, whereas in pre-Mughal period, that is the Sultanate, a Persianate culture isn't as well developed, right? And in fact, for example, we can take the Chandayan as a very good example of that. It's in a dialect which we like to call Awadhi, but I'll make a comment in a short while as what I think about that. I think it's actually problematic to call it that. But anyway, it's in the Awadhi dialect, and this dialect is part of a continuum of dialects that stretch from West Bengal, or today's West Bengal, all the way to Haryana, Rajasthan. It's a huge dialectical continuum. Right? And in 1379, when the poet Daud completed his Chandayan, he didn't use any non-Indian words in it. In other words, there's no Arabic and there's no Persian vocabulary in the Chandayan, right? So he wasn't concerned about that. He was someone quite different than Amir Khusro, whom we always cite, we always refer to as the parrot of India, and he's famous for his ghazals and his qawwalis and so on that are attributed to him. But the fact of the matter is that he's the anomaly in certain respects, whereas Dowd and those who follow him, like Malik Muhammad Jaisi, for example, or Qutban, these poets are writing in Indian dialect and are more concerned about their audiences, who would have been a mixture of people from various backgrounds, including religious backgrounds. So the Chandayan is a perfect example of that fusionary environment of the 14th century. I'd like to read a couple of quotes here. One is from work by Bruce Lawrence, who is a great Islamicist. And he said, "The endless struggle which has been ordained for man alone in the whole created order to seek perfection with clinging to the pain of love." Right. Now, he is, of course, a scholar of Persianate Indian literature. And clearly, one of the themes of the Chandayan is a Sufi one. Their main theme is a Sufi one, in which the pain of love is acutely experienced, right? But probably the shoulders that I stand on most firmly are those of another professor, Shyam Manohar Pandey, who is now retired. And he spent his entire career focusing on various aspects of the oral and literary forms of the Chandayan story. And this is a very important point that he makes in one of his books. He says, Maulana Daud was making a deliberate and conscious attempt to make a synthesis between two traditions. He was drawing his material from different sources to spread the message of love among the masses, Hindu as well as Muslim. Through a love, a man becomes divine. Without love, he is just a handful of ashes. This is a quote that Professor Pandey makes from Jaisi's Padmavat. Padmavat said that Jaisi says this: through love, a man becomes divine. Without love, he is just a handful of ashes. Continuing Professor Pandey's quote, this is the real essence of the philosophy of the Sufi poets in Hindi. And as long as humanity exists and the human values survive, nobody can deny the necessity of such ideals, which make us better human beings and teach us liberalism, broad-mindedness, and unity of existence on a profound level. So I quote from Bruce Lawrence and from Pandey. Um, Now, the Chandayan by Dowd. Who was Dowd? It is the only work that of Dowd that we are aware of, which is kind of strange. Jaisi, for example, wrote a number of texts. But on the other hand, it is a very important text because it's the first Sufi romance, Ramakyan. It's been called those terms, but it's known to itself as a Masnavi in the Persian literary tradition, although it's more like a Apabhramsa text than anything else, in fact. And this is what drew me to it. Dowd was a member of the Chishtiya Silsila. His sheikh's name was Zainuddin. Zainuddin was the nephew of Chirag Edili, Naziruddin Mahmud. In fact, Zainuddin became the Sajjada Nashin in 1355 when Naziruddin passed away. So Zainuddin plays an important role in the making of the Chandayan, obviously. I think that he probably encouraged Dowd to write this long poem, which was then used most probably by Zainuddin to teach disciples of the Chishtiya Silsila in Delhi. So this was written during the Tughlaq regime in Delhi. In 1379, Firuz Shah Tughlaq was the Sultan. It is pretty clear to me and other scholars as well that Dowd was fairly well known in the Tughlaq regime himself. He knew the prime minister, Jauna Shah. He knew the chamberlain, Mulak Nutten, and I'll mention Mulak Nutten again in my lecture. Dowd, according to Professor Pandey, Dowd hailed from Rudauli in what is now Uttar Pradesh, and he took up residence in Dalmau, a small fort on the northern banks of the Ganga, about 100 kilometers west of Allahabad, and also was well known to the Iqtidar of the fort at Dalmau. He mentions it, the fort and the Iqtidar. Let's see. So the Chandayan is a reflection of North Indian society in the last quarter of the 14th century, a time when the distinction between Hindu and Muslim was permeable. We mustn't forget that. It draws on elements of oral poetry and the conventions, rhetorical and metrical, of literary composition developed over millennia among poets of Sanskrit, Prakrit, Apabhramsa, and Persian. The text is a mirror of society, its social, religious, and above all, mystical and astrological beliefs. Astrology plays a huge role in the Chandayan, and this form of astrology is completely Indic, right? It doesn't borrow from any other culture. It perfectly weds the secular with the profane, worldly concerns with questions we have in relation to the ineffable creator. And in fact, in the Chandayan, the word Allah is never used, right? Sirjanhar is Dowd's word for God, okay? Which is traceable back to Sanskrit Srij, right? Srij means to create. For the contemporary audience in the 14th century, firstly during the teaching sessions or sama, auditions of the Chishtiya sheikh for which it was composed, and later during the recitation of the khutbah, by imams in the Friday worship, um, or in private readings. It must have been read in private as well. The Chandayan resonated, representing the realities and exigencies of daily life that depended on the negotiation of public and private relationships and beliefs that aided one's navigation through the effects of preordained fate. The Chandayan endowed are very much subscribers to the Indic notion of one's life being fated. It's also based on astrological concepts, as I've mentioned. So South Asian cultures today are the product of the accumulation of ancient, medieval, and modern human experiences. A close reading of the Chandayan helps us understand how the Indian subcontinent has arrived at its contemporary society. A rainbow of ethnicities, races, and religions. You know, I always tell my students here at UVA that there is no such thing as pure race. We are all mixtures, genetic mixtures. If you just think about this for a second, how many grandparents do you have? 4, right? How many great-grandparents do you have? 8. How many great-great-grandparents do you have? 16. And it doubles every generation, 32, 64, 128, 256. By the time you go back 200 years, all of us have about 1,000 grandparents. So if that's the case, there's no way that we can claim racial purity, because people are mixing all the time, either legally or illegally. And in fact, the Chandayan suggests that, because the Chandayan is based upon an elopement of 2 married people, Chanda and the hero Lorik. So masquerading as a tale of contemporary 14th century life, contextualized in a Hindu society in the text, we have an Islamic Sufi parable that navigates the path to Fana via the tariqah or system of procedure of the sheikh. With the addition of illustrated manuscripts of the tale, at least by the 15th and early 16th centuries, the Chandayan participates in the development of multiple painterly styles in the pre-Mughal period, providing a cultural and aesthetic rationale for later styles, particularly the so-called Rajput style. So encouraged by his Chishtiya sheikh, Dowd identified a popular folktale narrated among Ahir cowherders and well known among the masses, that could deliver in an entertaining tale of chivalry, anguished love, to be used in the Chishtiya Sama to reveal the Sufi path to Marifa, the mystical intuitive knowledge of spiritual truth, reached through ecstatic experience. Now, this was a problematic moment in the Sama teaching when a text like the Chandayan was being recited, possibly with a singer and musical instruments as accompaniments. Why? Because some Sufi philosophers thought, Chishtiya philosophers, and even Sharifuddin, the Bihari, the great Bihari sheikh, worried that stories like the Chandayan, falling into the ears of young, impressionable boys of the age of 15, 16, and so on in the Sama, would turn their attention away from the mystical message of the text, and they would get excited about the profane aspects of the text. So there was a challenge for the sheikh to describe in proper terms what the meaning of the allegorical meaning, if you will, the subterranean meaning of the text as it was being recited. So Dowd's adaptation of the tale and his rhetorical strategies would reverberate among Sufi poets who followed him. Without Dowd, we wouldn't have had, perhaps we wouldn't have had a Jaisi or a Kutman. As Aditya Bale said once, we wouldn't even have had a Tulsi Das. All of these poets were writing in the Awadhi dialect, right? And Dowd's Chandayan serves as a model for those who follow him. But as I mentioned earlier, Dowd is himself drawing upon an earlier tradition, which we only have remnants of now in the Apabhramsa literary tradition of the Jains, right? It's a stroke of good luck that the Jains were so good and are so good at preserving Indian literatures, whether it's a Jain literature or a non-Jain literature. They have been hard at work at preserving these traditions. So we are aware of the fact that the rhetorical strategies, even the meters of Apabhramsa poetry, are continuing into the Chandayan. The Chandayan is based, formally speaking, is based on this Apabhramsa model. Now, getting back to the methods of historiography, if you try to write the history of Indian literatures, when I was coming through graduate school, everything was all about Sanskrit. Sanskrit, Sanskrit, Sanskrit. You aren't a historian of Indian literature unless you know Sanskrit. And I was fortunate enough to have a mentor, Professor Ernest Bender, who encouraged me to look at Prakrit. From Prakrit and Pali, I went into Apabhramsa and did my dissertation on a Jain Apabhramsa text, not aware at that time that there was a Dowd and that there were even other Musnavis or Parmakyan, whatever you want to call them, like the Padmavat. I was unaware of that. It took me many years to figure it out, right? That this is continuity from Apabhramsa through the Awadhi texts. Let me, so we've almost spent already half of our time. Let me go into the text itself and give you some flavor of this text. Now, the text is divided into two parts. The first part is the invocation by the poet. And being a Muslim and an Islamic text, formally speaking, the poet will want to praise God first. Right? And that's what he does here in the Hamd, what's called the Hamd section. So, as I said earlier, he uses the word Sirjanhar for the creator, right? And you have to excuse my English. There is absolutely no way, and I discuss this in the introduction to my book called A Meditation on My Translation of the Chandayan, that there is no way I'm going to be able to recreate exactly the passion that the text has in the Awadhi dialect. First of all, it's all end rhyme, just like the Ramayana is all end rhyme, right? So there is a kind of musical aspect of this text that I cannot reproduce in my translation. But look at the second line, right? First I sing of the Creator who made this and all other lands. He made the earth and the sky, the mountains, Meru, Mandar, and Kailash. Now these are mountains, of course, everyone knows in the audience are sacred to Hindus and to Buddhists and to Jains, but not necessarily to Muslims. But right off the bat, the poet is getting the attention and the awareness of his audience because they know what Meru, Mandar, and Kailash are, right, for themselves. And then he goes on and mentions two important astrological spheres, the moon and the sun, which for Sufism are the two most important celestial orbs in the sky. They represent the human relationship with God, right? And in this case, Chanda, the heroine for whom the story is named, is the moon, astrologically. And Lorik, the hero, is the sun. And it's a beautiful marrying, if you will, combining of the sun and the moon in this whole concept, because the moon glows because of the energy of the sun. And he creates everything else, of course, even the cool shade, right? The clouds, the wind, the darkness, the flashing lightning, and so on. The entire world is his creation, and I have described it in one song. Joyful are my heart and mind, nothing else occupies my thoughts. So these sections I'm calling cantos for my translation in English, but they are better known in Indian literature as Karavak. Karavak. So Karavak is the word is related to katna, Hindi katna, right? That which is cut into pieces. So the existing Chandayan that we have is roughly 397 Karavaks. Unfortunately, we don't have the ending of the story. And this is a tragedy that none of the existing manuscripts contain the final chapters or Karavaks of the Chandayan. But based upon how the other poets wrote their stories following Daud, such as Jaisi, for example, for which we do have the endings, we can surmise, and also from internal references, which I'll show you in a minute, probably the story ends with the death of both Chanda and Lorik, which of course is allegorical. It suggests the merging of the heart of Lorik with God, Chanda. So the Hamd continues for a number of Karavaks. And then after 5 Karavaks, he does the obligatory praise of the Prophet in what is called a Naat in Persian, in Islamic literature. There's only one Karavak that praises the Prophet Muhammad. And then he moves on to the praise of the 4 right-minded caliphs, Abu Akbar, Umar, Usman, and Ali. Now he must praise his sultan, which he does in only one Karavak. But we know that, and then he goes on to praise his own sheikh. Now this is an important canto for a number of reasons. Let's look at it. Sheikh Zainuddin put me on the right path. On his path of religion, I destroyed sin. And look at the next line. I cast my sins in the Ganga. He lifted me into the boat of salvation. If this isn't a perfect example of the fusion, the unimportance, if you will, of divisions between Hindu and Muslim society in India, I don't know what is. He opened my eyes and my heart filled with light. He taught me to write new letters. This is an important line. Sheikh Zainuddin taught the poet Daud to write Nusk, to adapt Nusk orthography to the Awadhi dialect. He says, I became aware of the written word's power, and I wrote a Hinduki song in Turki script. In those days, the word Turki was used to gloss all references to Islamic society outside of India. If the sheikh's rule is spread, sin is stopped and the outlaw is killed. His khanka is pure, to it I am drawn. And then the poet spends quite a lot of time praising the prime minister of Sultan Firoz Shah. His name was Jauna Shah. And an interesting history of this man and his family should be mentioned here. Jauna Shah's father was a Hindu, a Telangana Hindu from central India, right? And when Muhammad bin Tughlaq invaded, sent his armies down to central India, he captured Jauna Shah's father, and Jauna Shah's father was converted. He converted to Islam. He went back to Delhi with Muhammad bin Tughlaq when the effort to change the capital to Daulatabad failed. He brought him back to Delhi, and Maqbul Shah became the prime minister of Firuz Shah Tughlaq. It became hereditary on the demise of his father, and Jauna Shah became the prime minister. And after the death of Firuz Shah in 1388, Jauna Shah unfortunately backed one of the rival wings of the family who was vying to become the Sultan, and he met his end because that particular wing failed, and Jauna Shah died, I think, in 1391 or somewhere around there. But he goes on for a number of Karavaks and describes Jauna Shah in glowing terms. In fact, he calls him the god of love, Ananga, Madan. So again, a fusing of Hindu of folklore in this tale. Here's the first example in my book of a folio held by the Chhatrapati Shivaji Memorial Vastu Sangrahalaya in Mumbai. Illustrated text which may possibly come from Mandu in the 16th century. And here's Jauna Shah dispensing justice. From the same illustrated manuscript, another image from the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in Richmond, Virginia. And this is a very interesting folio showing Jauna Shah, because in the middle you have a Brahmin philosopher and a Muslim cleric debating religion here. And at the bottom, there is a reference to the cow and the leopard. Actually, I think it's a tiger, or maybe even a lion, in which is mentioned here in the same canto, right? So Jauna Shah places people on his raft and pulls the rope with his hands, brings them to the shore. This is a time-tested Indic trope used to refer to how people pass through existence, right? From the life of the existential life to the afterlife, right? He treats Hindus and Turks equally, speaking truthfully to both, and he makes the cow and the lion walk the same path, making them drink from the same pool of water. Now here's the lotus in the pool. And as we all know, the lotus is the quintessential symbol of creation for Hindus, right? Inside the lotus is Brahma, the creator of the universe. Mount Meru is mentioned again. And then the Iqtidar of Dalmo, where Dowd perhaps composed this poem in Uttar Pradesh on the banks of the Ganga. And this Iqtidar is so generous, he's like Karna. Again, a reference to Hindu mythology. Then, fortunately, he dates his text, so we know exactly when it was completed. And then, after 17 cantos, the story actually begins. So I don't have time to go through the entire story, obviously, 397 cantos. But let me bring your attention to a few important points. Now we will be viewing as I go along here the various styles of illustrated manuscripts that we have, and which will be in the book in very large numbers, somewhere around over 300. And so you will be able to enjoy the text being narrated along with paintings. And Professor Adam G. will be making this point, I think, in her chapter, that even though there's a lot of similarity from one page to the next, for example, from this illustrated manuscript, which is now held in Manchester, England, this is the most complete illustrated manuscript that we have. Even though there seems to be a lot of redundancy from image to image in these in this codex, without the many images in the text, there would be a much less enjoyment of understanding the flow of the story. But unfortunately, art historians have ignored this text from that point of view. In other words, their viewpoint is, I can't afford to publish a book showing all of these images, and why should I anyway? Because there isn't much difference from one to the next. But that's not the point here. The point is that those who made these manuscripts made them for the enjoyment and the edification, if you will, of their audience, not for us. Right? So we have to understand these images in that context. So Dowd gives us an ethnography, if you will, of his society at that time. And who constitutes the society of the city of Govar, where Chanda lives with her father and mother? Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, Gwalas, Kandelawalas, Agrawals, Tiwaris, Panjawans, Dhakars, Joshis, Kandhais, Banjaras, Shravakas, Panvaras, and so on. Rawats, Chauhans, Thakurs, you name it. I mean, all of these names are current today. And this is 700 years before us. So for Dowd, this was his society. Then, of course, the court of Chanda's father, who happens to be the I don't know what you want to call it, the tribal, not the tribal leader, but the leader of the Ahirs in a mythical place called Govar. The market is described, the bazaar and the entertainments in the bazaar. Now look at the description here. All sorts of entertainments. Entertainers reciting the Ramayana of Child Ram. Clowns keep changing their clothing. Young and old alike come to watch them, like Radha and Krishna put jugs on their heads and rub lamp black on the body, etc., etc. More on the palace. Now, a very important moment, of course, in the story is the birth of the heroine. So let's quickly go to that. So here is Chanda's mother giving birth. And she was born in the house of Rao Maharaja Sahadev. She was now the astrology side of the story kicks in. Right? She was born in the first watch of the night. So the world thought there were two nights because there were two moons, one in the sky and one in the palace. The Pleiades twinkled in her part, in her hair. It seemed as if the sun brightened her body, prefiguring her relationship with Lorik, who represents the sun in the story. She became full on the 14th night, and of course, a full moon only grows after 14 nights. And she was number one beauty of the world. She was a Padmini, which is a classical category in Indian literature. Various beautiful women are categorized in Indian literature, and the Padmini is at the top of the list. Now, both Rahu and Ketu waited upon her. Venus and Saturn protected her. So these are the astrological aspects. And now, of course, Brahmins had to be invited. Here they are down here, and predict her horoscope. So on the 5th day after the birth, Brahmins examined it, her horoscope. And all the 36 castes of Gover were invited. Many people came from the palace harem. And it was declared by the Brahmins that it is written on her forehead, she will come to death's door at the supreme moment of life. So even though we don't have the ending of the story, this is probably prefiguring how it does end, right? Fire surrounds Chanda. She is not burned. As moths are drawn to light, kings will fly to her and die. And indeed, there is a king in the story that becomes impassioned over her and fights her father for possession of Chanda. So that forms a large part of the story, which is ancillary, of course, to the real goal of the story, which is to teach the pathway to mystical experience. We only have about 15 minutes, so let me just say here that a marriage proposal is immediately made by a neighboring king, and even though their horoscopes don't match, ultimately her father, Chanda's father, accepts the proposal, further fulfilling the promise of her horoscope, in fact. So there is a wedding. Procession is described in detail. Here's the marriage, the sacred fire of the marriage ceremony. Of course, there was a huge dowry involved, but she was married to a young man whose name was Shivadhar, which in Awadhi is Siohar. And after a few years had passed, he was brought to her to complete their marriage. But unfortunately, he had never washed his hands or feet or face, and he didn't sleep with her. Bhavan, unfortunately, was a dwarf, and he was blind in one eye as well. So it's not surprising here that the marriage was a failure. It's important to also note that, of course, since the marriage was not consummated, that the elopement that later occurs between Chanda and Lorik isn't technically speaking adultery, but of course, in traditional terms, it was very problematic that they eloped after both being married. She complains to her sister-in-law, to her mother-in-law. She finally goes back to her father's palace. And then a very interesting episode occurs. Here's Dowd in a manuscript that's held in Lahore and in Chandigarh. You know what? One of the even the manuscripts of the Chandayan represent what shall we say, the realities of contemporary South Asia. This particular manuscript was held in Lahore Museum in 1946, and there was only 24 folios. But in 1947, with partition, among other institutions in what became Pakistan and India, there were a lot of partitioning going on. And even this manuscript was partitioned, experienced partition. Half of it, or a little bit more than half, was kept in Pakistan, in Lahore, and the other part went to India. But this is the only manuscript that actually shows our poet here, Dowd, at the top. There's an episode, a very important one, where a traveling minstrel comes along and happens to see Chanda in the window, and she quickly closes the kavard, and he faints. Why did he faint? Because he saw God. And people come to his aid, and they ask him, what's going on with you? Why are you feeling so horrible? And he gives them a riddle, which is an important canto, one of the more important cantos in the story, because it's really an allegory. It's a riddle concerning his mystical experience, the mystical experience of the minstrel. People call me foolish and ignorant. I'll tell you about my anguish. Let the wise ones guess. There was a tree so high, its fruit touched the sky. No hand could hope to reach. Tell me, who can extend his arm so far? Who will grab the tree's branches? Night and day guards protect it. Even a person who dares to look is executed. Seeing a serpent on its branches and fruits, like a lotus, my heart withered. Though I was youthful like a tender shoot, I shriveled into a yellow leaf. When the winds of separation blew, rustling, I broke off and fell. So the tree is a representation of God, the Creator, which is impossible to reach or to see. So he quickly leaves Chanda's town because he doesn't want to be caught by the king singing about his daughter. So he goes to another town, and this is where the neighboring king Rupchand falls in love with the description of Chanda. And this is a long section in the Chandayan, which we call a sarapa, which is Persian for a description of a woman from head to foot, right? Which is exactly opposite of how a nakshik is deployed in Indic text, right? That would be from the toenails to the top of the head. But this is a very comprehensive description by the minstrel of Chanda. And I can't go through it all because it's too long. But by the end of the description, Rupchand, the king, is totally in love with Chanda, even though he's never seen her. And he promises himself to go kidnap her. So there's a long section there in the war between Chanda's father and this king. I can't obviously go through all that. And then there's a war, an assault on Chanda's father's palace. Now, when the war is not going well for Chanda's father, he sends a messenger to a famous soldier called Lorik. The royal bard is dispatched. And in this particular manuscript, Lorik is described as a giant. Look how tall he is compared to his attendant. And he's getting his battle armor ready, his arrows, his sword, his shield. And then he goes to battle. He asks permission from his wife, Mina, and his mother, Cohen. Mina plays a huge role in the story as well, the jilted wife, right? And she is devoted to him while he's absent, running off with Chanda. She remains pure, and she waits for his return. In the end, he does return with Chanda. But the point is that there was a lot of sympathy for Mina's story. And later, after the Chandayan, poets came along like Sadhan, for example, who wrote a version of the Chandayan highlighting the predicament of Mina as the jilted wife. So that's an important point to make here. The war is very long and gory. I'm not going to go through all that. So in the end, Lorik is victorious, and he arrives on an elephant in Chanda's the square in front of her palace, and for the very first time, Chanda over here sees Lorik, and she immediately falls in love with this man. He doesn't see her until later. So beautiful paintings of this moment. And then, interestingly enough, Chanda has a nursemaid whose name is Biraspati, or in Sanskrit that would be Brihaspati. That is the planet Jupiter. So the astrological theme of the Chandayan continues uh, in the person of not only Chanda but also her nursemaid Biraspati, who is also her advisor and confidant. So she's overwhelmed, and she then begins to think, how can I get closer to this man? And she convinces her father to hold a feast of victory. And the feast, the preparations for the feast are minutely described by Dowd, our poet, how they went out into the forest and collected all kinds of animals for dishes, birds, um, and then the cooks arrive, vegetables are cut, um, leaf plates are made, various preparations of dals and rice, all kinds of roti. Literally the forests of trees are stripped for their leaves in order to make plates and cups. And then guests are served. And very much like the minstrel, Lorik, while eating his meal, he looks up and he sees Chanda on the balcony, and he also faints and falls in love with her immediately, because after all, she is the epitome of the creation. Um, there's much more to the story, of course, and what happens in the end that at this point, Lorik is so troubled by his passions for Chanda that he withers away. He doesn't eat or drink. Um, and one day, Biraspati is visiting the marketplace, and she hears wailing going on, and she's drawn to Lorik's house, and she meets him, and she finds out that he's suffering. So Biraspati suggests to him that he become a yogi, an ascetic. So he joins a temple as a Gorakhnath yogi, and attends to Shiva, the Murti here at this temple. And there is Lorik with a nectar and singing. One day, Chanda comes to the temple by chance, um, and to worship the image. And Lorik recognizes her, although she doesn't recognize him. And he's again once very much troubled. So the story continues in this vein until a point where Brihaspati suggests to Lorik that he go personally meet Chanda in her palace. So she shows him the way, and one rainy night, he takes a rope and he climbs the wall of the palace and throws the rope to Chanda. You see how the paintings help us go through the text. You don't even need the text. The paintings are so detailed. She plays a game with him, and she unhooks the rope and she throws it down again. But then she sees how upset he is, so she asks him to throw it up again. And ultimately, he enters her chambers. And wall paintings are described in her bedroom by the poet. He says the entire balcony was vermilion covered, painted in gold, images of Ravan and Vibhishan from Lanka, the story of the Ramayana, the story of the Mahabharata are on the walls, painted and so on. So this is again a reference to Hindu mythology. Um, her bedroom is paradise, allegorically speaking. And Chanda and Lorik is experiencing paradise, having a mystical experience there. Now, this text is so long, I had to divide it into two sections. So I'm just going to quickly go to the other section here. And so he's overwhelmed with her beauty. And in fact, he had scared her when she woke up. So she pulls his hair. This is a funny moment, hilarious moment. But things get pretty serious fairly quickly. And he and she um, discuss their relationship. And ultimately, there is a scene of intercourse. So they can no longer stay in the palace, and they decide to elope, and they go away. So there's a whole section of the Chandayan about that, which allegorically speaking are the trials and tribulations of a search of man for God. So they leave the palace. Chanda comes down on the ladder, and they run away together. Basically, in the end, what happens is that I have to go over here. There are moments of crisis when Chanda is bitten by a snake while they are traveling by foot, and actually Lorik thinks that she has died and he's going to commit suicide, but a conjurer is brought in, and she is revived by the conjurer. Here he is, a sorcerer. Sorry. um, Ultimately, Mina is so upset by Lorik eloping that she's suffering greatly, and a description of how she suffers all 12 months is brought out by the poet here, which we can't go through in every detail. But this is again a classic example, an example of a classical literary trope from Indic literature, where love as described or experienced, the love as experienced during the 12 months of the year is described. So Mina is so impacted by Lorik's absence that she sends a message to him through a tradesman who is taking cattle of various places for sale, and she sends a message to Lorik through him. He meets Lorik, and his name is Surjan, and he meets both Lorik And again, the horoscope comes in play here, but this time with Lorik's horoscope, because Surjan is a Brahmin astrologer as well as being a tradesman. Um, so he talks about Lorik's horoscope here and says that it's an auspicious time for you to return to Mana. And of course, Chanda is very upset with this news, and ultimately they have the words between the two of them, and he convinces Chanda to come back with him to the town where they had left uh, Chanda's palace, where Mana lives, and the story unfortunately cuts off right after Lorik arrives and meets with Mana, and Mana is overwhelmed, of course, with emotion. She goes and offers milk to Lorik and his entourage, because she was a milkmaid, being a Ahir girl. Um, and now we're entering the last 10 cantos of the existing story. So what happens in the end, apparently, is that there is a kind of a reconciliation that occurs between Mana, Lorik, and Chanda, right? And unfortunately, we don't have the resolution of this reconciliation, how it plays itself out. But if you look at both the Chanda's horoscope earlier on in the story, and ultimately even the oral tale itself, which, by the way, is still told by here narrators in Western Bengal, western part of Western Bengal, Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh. This oral tale is still told even 700 years after the composition of this story. The death of Chanda and Lorik occurs in those narrations. So we can assume that this also is part of the ending of the Chandayan. I'll stop here, and I know I've already used up all our hour, but I'm sure we can spend a few more minutes with our questions.
I hope I am audible. So, thank you so much.
I can't. Here, okay.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir, for that wonderful discussion on the Chandayan. And there are some of the questions for you, but we'll take those questions. This is by Sukhdev Sohal. I think you can see that on the screen. This says, "How did poetry, higher linguistic expression, become dominant form of the Sufis and saints? Modern society has lost the edge of poetry to prose."
Yes. Well, this is not only the case in India, it's also the case around the world, unfortunately. Um, I'm not an expert in that. I haven't thought about it a lot, in fact, but it's a great question. Certainly, up until the 19th century in India, when the influence of Western literary styles began to impact Indian authors by, let's say, 1875, rather late, in fact. We don't get prose writings even in India. So the poetry format in India up until then was the preferred, not only preferred, it was the most respected form of literary creation and performance. So as a modern today, as a contemporary today, your the questioner is really bringing out an important point, but also must be aware. I encourage you to be aware of the fact that uh, prose is a latecomer to literatures around the world, um, because literature was experienced mainly orally before our modern period. And what could be more boring than to listen to a narrator not using poetic form? It's the poetic form itself that lends itself to the beautification, if you will, of the ideas in the story, not to mention the entertaining side of it, right? The entertainment value of a text. So today we have become silent readers of literature. I understand that in the medieval period in Europe, when people read manuscripts, right, which weren't either in poetry or prose, they would read out aloud to themselves. This tradition we have of writing, of silent reading, is a fairly recent development in human society.
Yeah,
Okay.
I have a question for you, Professor Cohen. When we compare these books like the Chandayan with original Persianate Arab books and these books of the late pre-modern Sultanate period, there are much more imagery that is used and aesthetic hybridity that we see in these books.
Yes.
So what were the causes and motivations, from moving from textual to using more of pictures and symmetrically using pictures with texts with pretext, as if we compare the other books, there were no pretext given to the pictures themselves.
Right. Well, I think art historians have worked through this quite a lot already, and my knowledge of art history in India helps me answer your question. I think that until the introduction of paper in India around, let's say, roughly 1250, 1300 AD, Indian books were written on other substances such as palm leaf, right? And palm leaves are very narrow, and so the shape of an Indian text before the introduction of paper was horizontal and limited in height. So yes, we do have illustrated palm leaf manuscripts in India, but they are disappearing by around the introduction of paper in 1100 AD, 1200 AD, 1250, and so on. So it is the vertical shape of the paper page that opens up the opportunities for Indian painters to explore different kinds of formats. And this was already the case in going on in Iran, for example. Persian literature was being illustrated in this way. So I think there was a lot of exchange of ideas about how to exploit um, the vertical folio as opposed to the horizontal folio. And then they take that idea and they run with it.
And we also see body centrism in this manuscript, Chandayan.
Yes, pardon me, I didn't get the first part of your sentence.
And we see body centrism, anthroposism in the pictures itself, a
Yes,
focus on the body rather
yes.
than other.
Well, that's not to say that Indian artists and painters of the medieval period, pre-modern period, weren't interested in nature, for example. I mean, there are not so much in the Sultanate period, but later on in the Mughal period, you have the patronage of paintings, of horses and elephants and other forms of forest life, flowers, beautiful paintings. So it's not entirely a body centric, although paintings were not cheap. They required a lot of time to make and expertise and money, and so it's understandable that painters and their patrons would be privileging pictures of human beings.
Uh, this question is by Aziza, and her question is: Greetings from Morocco. My question is: Why do we find rare written poetic records on women saints? How were Sufi women presented
Well,
in
that's
Indian Sufi manuscripts?
yeah. That I'm not too much aware of Sufi women being presented in Indian Sufi manuscripts. Um, in the case of the Chandayan, this is, as I say, it's an allegory based on an oral tale. And while there are are equal number of women in the story as men. Um, they have the traditional role of women at that time represented in the story. But as I've already mentioned, if you know, it's a stretch to call Mena and Chanda Sufi women, but I guess you could. I mean, they're no less Sufi than Lorik himself, right? And in fact, that's not the point, right? Dowd was not making the point here that I am talking about Sufi men and women in search of God. If you're going to discover that message, you have to sit with a sheikh and allow the sheikh to direct your attention in that direction. But this story can be enjoyed completely from a secular point of view. So I'm not a specialist of Indo-Islamic literatures as such, and how they are representing Sufi women, especially during the Mughal period, for example. Nur Jahan is an example, perhaps, of that, and the various important females who appear in Mughal literature and art. Um, but I'm not a specialist in that.
Yeah, we have one more question for you, Professor Cohen. This is by Sukhdev Soil again, and his question is there any reference or references to Lord Ram in the poetry? Which god or deity emerges prominent and why?
Right. Well, as I showed in my recitation of the story, yes, Ram is mentioned. Um, the poet doesn't go deeply into the story of Ram, but he does say that in the bazaar, the story of child Ram, um, Balika Ram is recited in the bazaar of Chanda's father's capital city, Govar. Entertainers are enacting the Ram Lila. Um, Scenes from the Mahabharata are mentioned. Um, Lorik himself becomes a Gorakhnath yogi and sits in attendance at a Shiva temple. So, to that extent, there are the stories of Ram, Krishna, and Shiva are part of the story itself, but not as the main theme. But it's interesting how, in a casual way, Dowd is introducing these deities, Hindu deities of mythology into the story. Is it not? And that harkens back to my opening remarks about how for Dowd this was his society, and he has no issues with it.
The last question for this evening is by Sudeep Ghosh. His question is: what is your take on the representation of Sufism in popular culture?
Which popular culture? The popular culture of that time or today? I can't tell from the question.
Uh, let's consider of that time.
Of that
If
time, right,
yeah.
right, right. Well, for Dowd, popular culture was symbolized uh, uh, in the oral tale of what was known, and even today is known as the Chanayani. The Chanayani, right? Chanayani is just simply a modern Awadhi for Chandayani, right? The story of Chanda. So it was popular then. It was hugely popular then, and even today we can find hear cast members narrating this story in various regions of North India. So I mean, uh, the continuity. India is always surprising us of the continuities that it contains. It's incredible. The Vedas, for example, are still used in rituals in India, right? I mean, my God, that's 3,000 years ago. So, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Cohen, for answering all the questions. And if our audience have any other question, they can mail us at carvanheritage@gmail.com. We'll forward those questions to Professor Cohen. He can get back to us through email. And thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Now it's time to listen Professor Cohen sing for all of us this evening.
I don't know. Do you think that I should do that? Um, Eshan, we were talking before we started, and when we, he realized that I compose music and play the guitar, that I have this particular song about the effects of hate on us all, and I could sing a few verses from that song. So I call that song "The Loop of Hate." The loop of hate. It's a circular thing. It never seems to leave us. Never seems to leave society. Right. So we all suffer from these emotions of love and hate, um, and we're trying our best to dispel the effects of hate. This story actually, this song I started to compose when I lived in a village in Rajasthan for 2 years as a Peace Corps volunteer 50 years ago. Okay. Why? Because the Vietnam War was raging at that time, and it was one of the main reasons why I became a Peace Corps volunteer as opposed to a a member of the U.S. Army in in Vietnam. I refused to go to Vietnam. So I had very few alternatives, and one was to join the American Peace Corps instead. So I had been to India before, and I wanted to go back. So I joined the Peace Corps and found a program in Rajasthan that I could be a part of for 2 years, and I was placed in a village, a very remote village, in fact, in Bundi district in Rajasthan. And I would hear the news from the radio, the transistor, every night about the goings on in Vietnam, and I was quite depressed and disheartened about all of that. So I began writing this song at that time. But the song has never left me, and I keep adding verses to it. Unfortunately, because hate has not disappeared from this earth. And even today in the United States, as you may be well aware, there are many mass shootings that are going on, right? 5, 10, 15, 20, 100 people lose their lives in these hate-filled actions taken by people holding guns. So this story, this song is actually a story, an ongoing story, and I've continued to add verses to this story of 50 years ago, and I call it a loop of hate. The loop of hate forms a noose and closes upon the people's neck. The politicians, they pull the rope tighter, lead the masses to an early death. Blindly we walk in a false paradise, knowing not where we tread. Nothing to do but bury the dead, hope that our children are wise. We labor by day and through the night, only to cloud the sky with light. As children playing with our toys, we make war to free all mankind. I sit alone in my room, my tears form a pool on the bed. Nothing to do but bury the dead and hope that our children are wise. The time has come for us to see, to discover the road of possibilities, where the honor of pain doesn't come too late, while the Pentagon dangles a gun as bait. Mystified by guns, we sit and wait, to wait for the sound of the hissing lead. Nothing to do but bury the dead and hope that our children are wise. The loop of hate has kept its shape. Signs of the times point to the date when all mankind will struggle for air, calmly complacent there and not to care as the clouds of pollution cover the sky. What have we done? Where have we gone? Nothing to do but bury the dead and hope that our children are wise. There are many more verses, but I don't have the time or energy to sing them all.
Yeah, that was a beautiful song, and we would love to listen to more of it in coming times. And we would love to host you again, Professor Cohen. It was truly an honor hosting you this evening, and we are really eagerly waiting for your book in
Yes,
January 22.
so am
And
I.
yeah, and we really hope that this loop of hate will end, and
Yes,
in India, in abroad, in this world.
right.
And we also hope that professional history will be promoted by all factions in India,
Hmm.
and
Yes.
which is very necessary, and that is the mission that Karwan has been up to. And we are really
Well,
thankful to you for contributing this lecture to that
uh,
mission.
one fact of life is that generations pass from one to the next. And as you can see, I am in the last stage of my life, and you are in the beginning stages of your life and your peers. And it'll be up to you, I'm afraid, for you to bring the change that is required.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Cohen.
Hmm.
It was truly
Sure.
an honor. And thank you so much, everybody, for joining in. If you have any question, you can mail us at carvanheritage@gmail.com. And do consider subscribing to Carvan. It's a small red button, beautiful red button that you can click and subscribe so that you will never miss any update from Carvan, any upcoming session. Just for the information of our audience, we have the next session we have is by Professor Narayani Gupta on the question of central vista. What do we want? Do we want a Rajpath or do we want a Janpath? So this is an essential question that needed to be addressed, and we'll be doing a session there. We have another session on 10th of July, if I'm not wrong, by Dr. Vivek Gupta on the art of the books of the Sultanate period. Thank you so much and have a great evening ahead.
Yes. Thank you so much. Bye bye. Take care.